Let's talk about two of the most loaded words out there, socialism and communism. Today, we're going to neutrally unpack the arguments from a source that really challenges some of the things we think we know about these ideas. Look, our goal here isn't to convince you of anything. It's just to lay out the information as clearly as possible so you can see the arguments for yourself. All right, let's get into it.
So before we go any further, just take a second. What's the very first thing that pops into your head when you hear those words? For a lot of us, their reaction is pretty visceral, right? The source we're diving into today argues that many of these gut reactions are actually built on a handful of powerful myths. And what we're going to do is explore how the source tries to take them apart one by one.
So, here's the game plan. First, we'll get the definition straight, because that's where everything starts. Then we'll dive right into the big myths, the idea that you'll lose all your stuff, the claim that it's all about rewarding laziness, the big debate over healthcare, and of course, the history of famine. And finally, we'll see how the source ties it all together with a pretty surprising take.
Okay, first up, definitions. Before we can even begin to tackle the myths, the source insists that we have to get our terms straight. Why? Because a lot of the confusion comes from just lumping a bunch of very different ideas under one big, scary umbrella. So what exactly is socialism according to this source? Well, the first thing to know is that it's not just one thing. It's a huge spectrum. A big piece of that spectrum are the social democracies you see today. You know, think of countries like Norway or Sweden. These places are fully democratic. They have elections, political parties, the whole deal. They just happen to use that democratic process to vote for market economies that also have strong public services.
Next up, communism. And this is a really important distinction the source makes. In the original theory, communism is this imagined, hypothetical endpoint. The source really hammers this home. This is a theory about a possible future, a classless, stateless society that has never, ever actually existed. It was envisioned as a world where people would be more free, not less.
Okay, so you're probably thinking, what about the Soviet Union? What about Mao's China? Well, the source argues that those were something else entirely, which it calls authoritarian state communism. And the key difference is right there in the name, authoritarian. These were real-world states run by single, all-powerful parties with zero democracy. The argument is that we have to separate this specific political structure from the economic theories we were just talking about.
All right, let's jump into our first big myth. This one gets at a really common fear, the idea that under socialism, someone's just going to show up and take all your stuff.
Our source gives this fear a great name, the toothbrush myth, and it uses this kind of silly question to get to a serious point. The fear isn't really about toothbrushes, right? It's about losing control, about having nothing to call your own. But the source says this whole fear is based on a massive confusion between two very different kinds of property.
And this slide right here is the absolute key to the whole argument. On the left, you've got personal property. That's your stuff, your car, your phone, your house, your toothbrush. The source is crystal clear. This is protected. But on the right, you have private property. Now, in this specific context, that term means something very different. It only refers to the means of production, things like factories, mines, huge corporate assets, things that are used to generate profit for an owner off of other people's work. That's the target for public ownership, not your personal belongings.
Okay, next up is another classic critique, the idea that socialism just makes people lazy, that if you can't get mega rich, nobody will want to work hard. The source we're looking at completely flips that argument around and asks a different question. In our system today, who gets to benefit without working at all?
To get their point, we need to understand this one little term, surplus value. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty simple. Imagine a worker makes, say, $1,000 worth of stuff in a day. They get paid a wage, let's call it $200. That $800 difference is the surplus value, and it goes to the owner of the company. It's the engine of profit.
All right, now look at this number, 16.2%. Just let that sink in for a second. What on earth could that be? Well, according to the source, this number is key to debunking that whole laziness argument. Let's see what it is.
So what is it? That's 16.2%? That's the slice of all personal income in the US that came from just owning things. We're talking about money from dividends, from interest, from rent. It's income that people earned not by going to a job, but passively, from the assets they already owned.
And if you zoom out a bit, it gets even bigger. When you add in things like government transfers, the total income that wasn't tied to someone actively working a job was over a third of the total pie that year. The source's whole point here is that we spend a lot of time talking about a lazy person getting a small benefit, but maybe we're ignoring this giant stream of income flowing to people who own capital.
And then the source puts that right up against the reality for a lot of people who are working, especially in the gig economy. Far from being a secure path, the data it points to shows huge numbers of working people facing deep insecurity. I mean, struggling to eat, struggling to pay their bills, sometimes even making less than the minimum wage.
This brings us to another huge one, healthcare. The criticism is that socialized medicine means long waits and poor quality. The source tackles this with cold, hard data, putting the U.S. market-based system side by side with the universal systems in other developed countries.
Wow. Okay, the first thing that just jumps out at you is the cost. Per person, the U.S. spends almost $13,500 a year. And as you can see, that is nearly double what other wealthy countries spend on average. So the big question the source poses is, what are we getting for all that extra cash?
Well, when you look at the results, the picture is pretty rough. This chart shows maternal mortality. The rate in the U.S. is over 3.5 times higher than the average in comparable countries. That's not just a number, right? The source points to this as a major sign of a systemic problem with access and quality of care, despite all the money being spent. And maybe the most basic measure of all, how long do people live? Well, check this out. Mine is 4.1 years. That's the life expectancy gap. The data shows that on average, people in the U.S. live over 4 years less than people in these peer countries that have universal health care.
All right, now we have to talk about probably the heaviest, most emotionally charged criticism of all, famine. The association between communism and mass starvation is incredibly powerful. And here, the source makes a very careful, very important distinction.
The source doesn't shy away from the horrifying famines of the 20th century. But it argues that the cause wasn't simply collectivizing farms. It says they were the direct result of brutal political commands from totalitarian governments, like forcibly seizing all grain from peasants in the Soviet Union, or literally ordering farmers in China to stop farming and make steel instead. These, it argues, were catastrophic political failures, not just economic ones.
So after looking at those historical tragedies, the source turns the lens back on us and asks this question. If the goal is to feed everyone, how is our current global system doing? Especially now, when we have the technology to produce an incredible amount of food.
Get ready for this number, 673 million. That's how many people, according to the source, faced hunger in a recent year. And here's the core of its argument, that hunger exists even though we, as a planet, produce more than enough food to feed every single person. The problem isn't production, it claims, it's distribution. It calls this structural hunger.
Okay, so this is where it all comes together. The source takes all these points and builds to its final argument, which is pretty provocative. The idea is that the most common criticisms of socialism are actually like looking in a mirror. They're inverted reflections of problems that are happening right now in our own systems. So let's just run through it one more time. The whole idea of rewarding laziness, the source says, look at the 16% of income going to passive asset owners. The critique of poor healthcare, look at a system that costs twice as much for a shorter lifespan, and the charge of causing famine. The source points to a global system that presides over mass hunger despite having more than enough food for everyone. And the source wraps up by pointing to real-world examples, saying that the success of social democracies is proof. It's proof that you can have economic equity, things like universal health care and strong safety nets, without giving up political freedom. In fact, it argues these things can actually strengthen democracy.
And that's where we'll leave it. Not with a clean answer, but with the big question the source wants us to think about. If the criticisms we usually aim at one system seem to bounce right back and stick to our own, what does that mean? What new questions should that make us ask about the economic world we live in right now? That's the thought this explainer leaves you with. Thanks for joining me.